I'm afraid that a lot of you are here under false pretenses because you read Kai's blurb about what's going on today. In that blurb, he said that I would be talking about the swirl of controversy surrounding the renaming of this city to Rock Island in 1841, amidst the swirl of the rapids at the foot of. That didn't happen. 1841 was the quietest year in the history of Rock Island. You have to know something about Kai. A few of you don't know him, and here's what you need to know. His gift of gab was discovered early. One day when he was in first or second grade at Longfellow School, the principal called up his mother and said, "Where should we bring the stuff?" She said, "What stuff?" She said, "Well, the clothing, the household supplies, the money we collected for your fire." "What fire?" "Well, Kai described how your house caught on fire and you lost everything." He had turned a little kitchen fire, which was easily put out, into a house fire that lost everything. And they believed Kai so much that they didn't even bother to check on whether it was true or not. That has been Kai almost ever since. There does turn out, however, to be controversy about the naming of Rock Island. First of all, the naming of Stevenson and then the changing of the name to Rock Island. It did take place, however, much earlier than 1841. So what I'm going to do today is imitate one of my favorite novelists, Lord Stern, who wrote a book in the mid-18th century called The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. It was a scandalous book when it came out. It ended up being 7 volumes long. It ended up being 7 volumes long because Tristram Shandy could never tell why something happened without telling why that happened and then why that happened. It begins with Shandy as a young boy who has to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, and so he lifts the window sash and pees out the window. However, the window sash falls on him, inflicting a very painful accident, which influences the rest of his life, his opinions, and his life. But in order to tell us why the window sash fell, he has to explain that there were no lead weights in the windows anymore. Well, why are there no lead weights in the windows anymore? Because his Uncle Toby had taken them to melt them into cannonballs. Why did his Uncle Toby do that? Because his Uncle Toby was wounded in a famous battle, and in the backyard he's recreating that battlefield, etc., etc. And so it takes about 4 volumes for Tristram Shandy even to get born. So I'm going back today at the beginning and then ending with 1841. I'm going to try to do it in more or less chronological order with a few little side trips. And those side trips too have to do mostly with the naming of Rock Island. I want to divide this into 3 parts to try to make it clear. I'm going to start talking about clearing the land. That's a satiric word, I think, because what it meant for the Americans was getting rid of the Native Americans. Then I'm going to talk about settling in, the way in which white settlers began to encroach on those Indian lands, and then end by talking about Rock Island County and the county seat. So let me begin with a date that probably is the most important date in the whole history of this area. On November 3rd, 1804, in St. Louis, 4 Sauk Indians from the Des Moines River area, no one knows quite who they were or what status they represented, met with William Henry Harrison, who incidentally is going to be the topic next week. William Henry Harrison was then the governor of Indiana Territory and also governor of the District of Louisiana. They were trying to get a friend of theirs out of jail. But somehow, after a little liquor and some other things, they signed a treaty giving up all the Sauk and Meskwaki lands from the Illinois River to the Wisconsin River. They had no right to do it. They really didn't even know what was happening because their idea of ownership didn't include actually owning the land. And for the next 30 years, until there was really a Rock Island, that treaty was gone back to again and again and again to prove the legitimacy of our claim on this land. What did they get in return for ceding all that land, plus an additional, as an aside, 15 million acres in Iowa? They got $2,200 on the spot, and the Sauk Nation got $1,000 a year as an annuity for thereafter. There was a protection written into that seemed to make it safe for the Indians to do this. And that was that the Indians could live on the land as long as the United States owned the land, and furthermore that they would be protected from the other Indians, the Ojibwe and the Potawatomi and the Sioux, who were giving them problems. So everything seemed okay. Nevertheless, this came back to haunt the Sauk Nation time and time again. For the next 30 years then, this bogus treaty was used again and again. Let me move quickly to the War of 1812 against England and the United States. That split the Sauk Nation. There was a party under Keokuk, who was the real chief of the Sauks in this area, and Black Hawk, who was a war chief. Keokuk, realizing the inevitable, took as many Sauk as would go with him and moved down to what is now Keokuk, Iowa, to the mouth of the Des Moines River on the Iowa side of the river. Black Hawk, however, not only refused to move, but he was engaged in two battles, the Battle of Credit Island and the Battle of Campbell's Island. The Battle of Campbell's Island was the most significant battle, historians call it, fought by Indians without British help in the War of 1812. So the two westernmost battles of that war were fought here, but it did no good to the Sauk. It didn't help Black Hawk to win those battles. He was captured eventually, and I'll get to that in a minute. In 1815, the Sauk signed another treaty under pressure in which they agreed to move across the Mississippi River into Iowa, lock, stock, and barrel. Black Hawk refused to sign for a year, but eventually he did sign it and briefly moved across the river, but he could never stay away from Saukenuk, the principal village of the Sauk, where he lived and had his being. So part of the problems was that Black Hawk and his particular group of people refused to stay across the river. In 1816, just a year later, soldiers came up from St. Louis to Fort Armstrong and built Fort Armstrong along with 5 other forts along the river. The purpose was not to protect whites from Indians. The purpose was to protect our fur trade from the British, and in fact to protect the Indians from the encroachment by whites, which was already beginning to happen. So Fort Armstrong really was not a particular threat to the Sauk people. Along with Fort Armstrong came a sutler, George Davenport, who was an Englishman who in 1804 had broken his leg, and the English ship left America without him, and he ended up joining the army and eventually becoming a sutler. So in 1816, he came to settle near Fort Armstrong. He built a 2-story log cabin for his trade. He started to trade with the Indians, and he will play an important part, of course, in the formation of Rock Island, Stevenson. In 1818, Illinois became a state. The southern half was fully settled. The northern half was almost not settled at all, north of the Illinois River. But Illinois had enough people in the south to become a state. That led in 1819 to what is called the Indian boundary line by 2 surveyors, Sullivan and Duncan. who drew a line that was supposed to go from the tip of Lake Michigan directly west to as close to the mouth of the Rock River. Isn't quite. That line was skewed, and so they were asked to redraw it in 1821. Two surveyors named Flack and Bean redrew the Indian boundary line. Essentially, that's the line that you see if you go to the Augustana campus and see a little monument down near the slough. That's the Indian boundary line. It's the back of our property. It separates our property from the north side of Lincoln Park. It goes essentially down 9th Avenue in Rock Island to the Rock River. That's the boundary line that becomes important. It was especially important because originally that boundary line was not only an Indian boundary line, but it was intended to be the boundary between Illinois and Wisconsin. If it hadn't been for some shenanigans in the Illinois legislature, we would be sitting in Wisconsin today. But several legislators realized that that line gave us no access to Lake Michigan and to the trade, to the Great Lakes, and to the civilization that was coming eastward. And so somehow they were able to convince the government to put that Indian boundary line, not the Indian boundary line, but the line between Illinois and Wisconsin, 100 miles or so north, just north of Galena and Dubuque. And that's how we came to be what we were. In return for that, Illinois or Wisconsin got a little more land that Michigan was supposed to get, and Michigan, not to be left out, was pushed down a little bit, and so the southern boundary of Michigan is further south than it was supposed to be. But at any rate, we are in Illinois and not in, I always used to tease Treadway because if the Indian boundary line had held true, those pesky presidential offices would be in Illinois and I could be in Wisconsin in the English department. Now, we begin to settle in. And settling in is a long process because Black Hawk particularly, and many of the other Indians, the Potawatomi and the Chippewa, didn't always stay where they had promised they would be. The first settlement in Rock Island, in what is now Rock Island County, it wasn't even Rock Island County then, was a little village, if you could call it that, called Farnhamsburg. Farnhamsburg was a joint venture between Russell Farnum and George Davenport, who went into the fur trade together. Davenport gave up his fur trading business and merged with the American Fur Company, and they built a log cabin to use as headquarters in what is now fairly close to 5th Avenue and 28th Street in Rock Island. You can see a plaque there today telling you where Farnhamsburg was. Farnhamsburg ran from there essentially down to the river. Let me tell you one of my diversions, Russell Farnham's story, because somebody, and I don't have the scheme anymore, somebody needs to write Russell Farnham's story, either as an adolescent novel. I mean, I don't know how many writers are in the audience, but this you've got to do, because it's almost unbelievable. Here's how Russell Farnham got to Farnhamsburg. In 1807, when he was 23, he was hired by John Jacob Astor out east to head an expedition to the mouth of the Columbia River to build a fort to keep the fur trade away from the British and the Russians, the American Fur Company. He set out from St. Louis with 70 men. Blizzards and hostile Indians, by the time he got to Oregon, had killed off everyone except 8 people. These 8 people reached what is now Astoria just in time to see the ships that Astor had sent around the Cape of Horn to take them home disappearing in the distance because they'd given up. Now 4 other people were killed, I believe 3. One day, Russell Farnham killed a Nez Perce Indian that he caught stealing. The Nez Perce tribe captured him and took him up to Canada. They kept him there for 4 years, Then they took him up to a Russian trading post in Alaska, where he was able to wire Astor for ransom money. It took letters 3 years to reach Astor and return with the ransom money, which Astor paid, and Farnham was free. How to get home? He crossed over into Siberia, walked down through Siberia, across Europe, and up to the American Fur Company office in Copenhagen, Denmark, and said, here I am, 10 years later. Astor paid the whole 10 years salary to Russell Farnham, $1,400. And it is that $1,400 that brought Russell Farnham to go into business with Davenport, and for a while. Russell Farnham eventually ended up in St. Louis, so he didn't stay that long. He didn't stay long enough to participate in the formation of other cities here. But other things are happening. When Illinois became a state in 1818, the whole north of the Illinois was called Pike County, just one huge empty lot. In 1827, another huge county was carved out of a part of Pike County, Joe Davies County, with its headquarters in Galena. Now, in 1828, remember that Treaty of 1804, the Sauk can live on their land as long as the United States owns the land. There was an easy way around that. The United States had a huge land sale in 1828, a land office sale. People bought up all the Sauk lands, including Davenport and Farnham. Davenport and Farnham together bought 80% of that land, including the whole site of Saukenuk. Davenport's claim was that he did that to protect the Indians from white settlers. But he may have had finance, nobody really knows. It didn't protect Saukenuk from settlers very much. At any rate, so in 1828 now, the land of the Sauks officially becomes land owned by Americans, even though Black Hawk continued to live in Saukenuk. In Rock Island County, got formed on February 9th, 1831, as a leftover. Joe Davies County was being carved into smaller counties, and apparently nobody wanted this crazy strip of land that comes all the way down past Hampton and Port Byron and then becomes Lower Rock Island County. At any rate, the legislature authorized Rock Island County on February 9th, 1831, as soon as the number of residents in the county reached 350. That happened a year later, and so the boundaries of what is present-day Rock Island County were set in 1832. It was divided into two precincts, or townships, upper and lower. The lower township was centered around Fort Armstrong. The upper township was centered around what is now Port Byron and what was the fledgling community of Hampton. In 1831, as all part of this deal, Black Hawk again agrees to move across the Mississippi River to Iowa, and he does. But then in April of 1832, for reasons that can be disputed, Black Hawk and his followers, including women and children of about 1,500, crossed the river at Oquaka and headed back toward Saukenuk. His claim was that he was not going to Saukenuk. He was going to visit a Potawatomi chief upriver, up on the Rock River. Everybody here was afraid that it was war, and so they literally invented a war. There were any number of incidents in which the Sauk would have given up easily and gone home. They did try to surrender at what came to be known as the Battle of Stillman's Run, but the frightened soldiers shot the people who came to surrender, and that forced Black Hawk to flee further up. It never really was a war, it was a skirmish. Some people call it a massacre. But at any rate, in the Treaty of September 21st, 1832, at the end of the Black Hawk War, the Sauk were given until June 1st, 1833, to move out of Rock Island County. That led to the election then of county commissioners 4 days later, on July 5th, 1833. There were two factions in Rock Island County. As Kai well knows, there still are. There were the island people, or the Farnhamsburg people, led by George Davenport and several of the people on the island, and some people living on Vandross Island, and some people that were already living in Saukenuk. And then there were the Hampton, or the mainline people. They were centered upriver under a man whose name I'm sure you've all heard, Archie Allen. And the Hampton people were afraid that the Davenport people would signal the island if they weren't getting enough votes, and so they had a plan to steal the poll book and stop the election. Davenport got wind of this. He gave the two clerks who were operating the election a fake poll book. The Hampton people stole the fake poll book. They were chased by island people to make it look real. And the minute they were out of sight, Davenport opened the real poll book, and the vote took place. There were only 65 votes cast in a county that was supposedly had 350 people. So it was a fairly weird event. At any rate, obviously, if the mainland people had won, and there were enough people living up there to have swung the vote, the county seat would not be right here in this city. It would be probably up by Hampton or at Fort Byron or someplace up there. At any rate, what the election was to elect 3 commissioners, and those 3 commissioners, once the votes were counted, were George Davenport, George Harlan, and John W. Spencer. They met, the election was held at the John Barrel House in Farnhamsburg. I haven't been able to find out much about that, but it must have been a magnificent home because it's where the courthouse was held until there really was a county seat. It's where elections were held, it was where the jail was, and all kinds of things like that. So, not only were county commissioners, 3 county commissioners elected, but also a sheriff, 3 justices of the peace, 3 constables, and 1 coroner. The first meeting 3 days later, on July 8th, 1833, the first acts of the commissioners were to do the following. They fined Archie Allen of Hampton $3 for assaulting a Farnhamsburg voter. They all took oaths never to fight a duel. They authorized a county seal to include a sheaf and a plow. I'm not sure why, in a river town, a sheaf and a plow were to become, and if anybody knows, I would certainly like to know. They imposed a tax of 0.5% on slaves, indentured Negroes, and mulattoes, on carriages, carts, wagons, distilleries, furniture, clocks, and all livestock. And they set tavern rates for lodging and for food. And then they eventually brought a post office from Fort Armstrong down to the John Barrel House. Now, slaves, indentured Negroes, and mulattoes in Illinois, of course, right? You know the case of Dred Scott. There was down near where the Iowa Center is now, for a couple of years, a slave plantation with 75 slaves. Somebody brought them up from Kentucky. He met with a very hostile environment, I could say, from local residents in the county, and so he eventually tucked up and went away. But remember, you know, people ask, if you read Huck Finn, if Jim is trying to escape from slavery and he gets on that raft, why didn't he just go across the river to Illinois, a free state? Wrong, right? Illinois was a free state, but the early Illinois laws permitted you to keep the slaves that you have, and even if they weren't slaves, they could be indentured Negro servants. And then if you had children by a slave, a mulatto, that would also count as a slave. So Illinois' story with slavery is a very strange and complex thing. Part of that is because so much of Illinois was settled by people from the upland south. They would come down the Ohio River and come up the Mississippi River. Getting out here from the east was very, very difficult. At any rate, now we have at the John Barrel House in Farnhamsburg, county commissioners, the county court, we have laws, we have all those kinds of things, and we have a post office. Now, to pick out a town site. The commissioners were authorized to pick out a town site, and so in 1835, this is 2 years later, the county commissioners paid or bought 61.95 acres for the county seat. It was a 20-block community between what is today 10th and 17th streets, and from 5th Avenue to the river, essentially what we would now call the old Chicago edition. That was the original town that was going to be the county seat. It was a grand town of 20 blocks. The lots were very good for those years, 80-foot fronts by 150-foot deep. They authorized 1/3 of the lots for sale at that first meeting, and they realized $4,000 from that. So they submitted the plat for this town. It had streets, incidentally, like Cherry, like Plum, like Oak, like Illinois. Beautiful streets, because they envisioned here a grand county seat. Let me move ahead a little bit. In 1876, the Rock Island Council treated itself, the members of the council, to a trip to the centennial of our country in Philadelphia. And they discovered to their horror that all the fancy towns out east, like Philadelphia, New York, they didn't have names like Cherry and Plum. They had 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street. And so they came back and immediately changed all the streets. Illinois Avenue became 2nd Avenue, et cetera, et cetera. And that made us up to date. I don't know, I would prefer Cherry, Plum, or in other words, be like Bergendoff, right? Bergendoff doesn't have street names, it has those beautiful names, Englefoot, Wood Glen, and so forth and so on. So, at any rate, they sold 1/3 of the lots, and they submitted to the legislature in Illinois this idea. On the submission, the name for the town was, as you might expect, Davenport, because Davenport, and that's why he didn't want to use Farnhamsburg for the town. He wanted a town named after himself. It turns out, however, that in the legislature, there was a gentleman named James M. Stroud, who had been a colonel in the Black Hawk War, and whom Davenport had loudly and repeatedly and publicly shamed for stupid activities as a soldier in the war. And Stroud did not forget that. And so he made a passionate plea in the legislature to have the town named in honor of a great citizen from Galena, Benjamin Stevenson. Benjamin Stevenson, it probably didn't hurt that he had a son who was a Springfield politician and a Black Hawk War veteran himself, James Stevenson. And so Davenport lost out, and the town was named by the Illinois legislature Stevenson. That never did sit very well with the residents of that town, but they lived with it, and it didn't come to a head until 6 years later. Let me make another little digression. One of the first families to move into town, and this makes a big difference, I think, in what our town looks like today, were the Bufords from Kentucky. John Buford, his son Napoleon, his other son John Jr., both of whom were already West Point graduates, and 2 other sons owned 10,000 acres in the heart of Bluegrass country in Kentucky. They were fabulously well known. Their estate, Rose Hill, their farm was like Tara in Gone with the Wind. It was the place where all the social doings of that neighborhood were held. But in 1935, John Buford's wife died suddenly in a cholera epidemic, and all of a sudden, almost overnight, he sold every bit of property, all 10,000 acres, and he moved to Stevenson, one of the first residents of Stevenson. Why did he move to Stevenson? Because his son Napoleon, fresh out of West Point in 1829, had been ordered here to map the Rock Island Rapids. He didn't do a very good job of it because it was February and there were 2 feet of ice on the snow. So what you see is a line up the middle of the river. Not nearly as good as Robert E. Lee's map in 1836. But Buford had been here and he just loved this territory. He couldn't get over how beautiful the land was here. And so without ever having seen it, John and Napoleon's brothers moved lock, stock, and barrel to Stevenson. John immediately adopted Stevenson. He called it the New Jerusalem. He built a storefront on the levee that had a huge high front that was painted to look like granite. He never liked it. He said it reminded me of a ruffled man's shirt. He was the first general storekeeper in Rock Island. Napoleon became the owner of the Rock Island of a pork packing plant. He became the owner of the Rock Island Plow Works. Napoleon's wife loved Spain, and so when Rockport, just north of here, came up for sale, Napoleon bought Rockport and renamed it Andalusia. So without the Bufords, we would be quite a different place. It was John Buford who just began to really push Stevenson as a place to be. And so when John Deere came to town looking for a place along the Mississippi River where he might move his plow works and be closer to the action than Grand Detour, John suggested, why don't you go over and visit that dam across the slough to the island. There's a lot of power there, and you might get some friendly hints. And so that is why, one of the reasons certainly, that John Deere ended up in Moline. Moline didn't even exist at that point, but that's John Buford. I want to say this too because one of the interesting things to me about the Quad Cities is how different the makeup of each of these Quad Cities is. The Bufords were not the only Southerners to come to Rock Island. Rock Island was essentially settled by people from the South. So that when I came here in 1960, and as a teacher of English and interested in words, I discovered all kinds of Southern pronunciations, Southern words. For example, just one, that thing that protects us from the water down here in Rock Island we call the levee. That's a Southern term. By the time you get to Clinton, it's the seawall, a New England term. So Rock Island was so heavily settled by Southerners that there was a very small and not very effective reverse underground railroad helping prisoners escape from Arsenal Island and go back to the south and fight. Cape Perry is one of the leaders of that railroad. But, and in fact, in the election of 1860, Lincoln was soundly defeated by Rock Islanders. Whereas in Moline, 90% of Moline voted for Lincoln. Rock Island wanted Breckinridge, and that's who they voted for. So the southern, and then Moline was settled by Yankees and then Swedes later, who had the same work ethic, and Davenport was settled much more cosmopolitanly by the Irish and especially by the Germans, and they brought that culture there. So almost from their very beginning, these three cities, the Tri-Cities, have had a whole different personality. And a great part of that is because of John Buford. At any rate, that's 1835. Then, in 1837, it came time to build a courthouse. That courthouse was a fairly fine affair. used 200,000 bricks. It cost $12,500, and it was 2 stories. It had a staircase inside, a grand curving staircase, and it had a cupola on top. Shortly thereafter, but after 1841, after our period today, they added a new front with columns. So that if you've seen pictures of that early courthouse in Rock Island, standing where the current courthouse stands, it looks southern. It's got a southern mansion look to it. In the same way, the Napoleon Buford's house, which is on 7th Avenue, and I believe it was when I came, the Tri-City Jewish Center, but it's down on 7th Avenue, that house with the white columns, that's Napoleon Buford. Even a lot of buildings, if you look carefully, if you know about architecture, buildings in Rock Island, a lot of them nod to the southern feel. Anyway, the courthouse, once it was built, became a grand affair. It was used for civic events. You could rent the courtroom for $1 a day if you wanted parties or weddings or anything like that. Now, there is another difficulty. And that difficulty, why we almost didn't get named Rock Island, is that in 1837, 2 years after Stevenson was formed, 3 investors from the East, Levi Turner and a lawyer, and William Dixon and his son, bought Saukenuk from George Davenport, 608 acres. They bought half interest in it. Davenport knew a good thing when he saw it. And they set up some place they called Rock Island City. That was essentially from 31st Avenue to 24th Street. It was 608 acres. They had 1,380 lots, but it was a paper city. They did not intend to settle it. They intended to sell it out east, and not even to people who were going to buy it. They intended to sell it to investors who were going to sell their parts of it, and eventually would get down to people who would pay big money for individual lots. But it had a beautiful storefront. There were all kinds of houses and buildings and stores planned for it. And the reason for it was, why there? Because it was supposed to be another Pittsburgh. It was at the juncture of the Illinois, of the Rock River and the Mississippi River, and the state of Illinois had promised to make the Rock River navigable all the way to Lake Michigan. And in fact, in 1836, the state of Illinois embarked on a scheme of internal improvements. Every single city in the state was going to be connected either by a railroad, a canal, or a road, a highway. And obviously, it was 3 times what Illinois in total was worth, and it went bust a year later in the general panic of 1837. And so, Rock Island City, had it lived, obviously there would be no Rock Island, right? Because the name would already have been taken. The Rock Island City is famous today because Daniel Webster, the orator, invested $60,000 in what he thought was 1/6 interest in Rock Island City. He had sent his sons out here to look for deals, and they found the deal there in Saukenuk. William Dixon, I might say, wasn't discouraged. He went across the river and found the town of Camden, and Camden stayed Camden until the 1870s, when a watchmaker came and built a 4-story factory on the banks of which is now the cotton mill apartments, a 4-story factory to manufacture watches. And Camden, knowing a good thing, thought Milan, Italy is the headquarters of great watchmaking. Let's change our name to Milan, so we will cash in on this. The date came when the 400 people were going to be employed by this watchmaker, and he never showed up. Walmart is not anything new. At any rate, that really brings us close now. Meanwhile, in 1836, George Davenport and several investors went in with Antoine Leclerc, who lived on the other side of the river, and they built a town there, which Antoine Leclerc, in honor of his friend, named Davenport. So there was a Davenport. Now, Stevenson, meanwhile, really was an amazing town as far as growth is concerned. Steamboat traffic was taking off. The first steamboat hit here in 1823, but by 1835, when Stevenson was born, there were 25 regular steamboats plying their trade, and they had to stop someplace to somehow get across the Rock Island Rapids, and this was the perfect place to do it. By 1839, there was a newspaper, the Stevenson Gazette, which in 1841 became the Rock Island Banner, and in 1840, a second newspaper, the Upper Mississippian. Here's an editorial from 1839 that tells you what Stevenson was like. The editor is amazed because in 1835 he said there was one house in Stevenson. Now in 1839 there were 175 houses, 600 residents, 7 stores, 3 taverns, 3 groceries, 2 saddle and harness shops, 2 cabinet shops, 1 cooper shop, 1 watchmaker, 1 tinning shop, 1 pottery, 3 physicians, and of course 4 lawyers. Because this was the county seat. There was also a judge. John Spencer had become the county's first judge. And in due fashion, the editor took his opportunity to knock the other towns that were competing with Stevenson. One of these was the new town of Bloomington, which was in the process of changing its name to Muscatine. He said in this editorial, he says I don't know much about Muscatine, he said, but it has the appearance of being a very sick place. If I can judge by the likes of the citizens on the steamer who came up last week. By 1840, it had 183 new residents, and by 1841, 25 new buildings since 1839. Let me digress a little more. By 1839, Davenport was already, even though it was later than Stevenson, Davenport was already becoming larger than Rock Island. I have debated with all sorts of people when we were in the regional studies program at Augustana why it is that with almost no exceptions, the cities on the west side of the Mississippi are larger and more successful than the cities on the east. St. Louis, East St. Louis, Keokuk, Warsaw, Fort Madison, Burlington, Davenport, Rock Island, Minneapolis and St. Paul, Dubuque and East Dubuque, with the exception of La Crosse and Prairie du Chien. Why would that be? And I'm not going to say because I don't know, but it is fun to sit back and have a bull session or two about that. At any rate, in 1841, there was another booster who had come from the south. Silas Reed was a doctor, and he came to Rock Island, and he became, just like the Bufords, one of the great boosters. But he particularly had never liked the name Stevenson. Nobody in Stevenson really liked it. And so in 1841, Silas Reed took it upon himself to go down to the Illinois legislature and ask if they could change their name to Rock Island. The legislature complied completely. There was no controversy. Why was that? Because that politician Stevenson in Illinois had been caught with his hand in the till. Not the first and not the last time that has been done. And so the name Stevenson was in special disgrace. And so in 1841, the name was changed to Rock Island. It didn't achieve city status till 1849, incidentally, but it was a town. But it wasn't, Rock Island in 1935 and 1941, the Rock Island City Council had a real difficulty in trying to decide which was its centennial. Or in 1985 and 1991. What do we celebrate? Is Rock Island I changed my mind on that as part of doing this paper. Rock Island is not the town that Stevenson was. It's a different town. Here's what the legislature, they not only changed the name, but they added 4 new trustees, so there were now 9. The new city of Rock Island included all of Stevenson, included all of Farnhamsburg, and it included the 3 additions that had been made to the town by various people. The Spencer Case addition, the Thomas and Wells addition, the Jones, Garnsey, and Beardsley addition. So Rock Island more than doubled the size over Stevenson. Stevenson became a small part of what is today Rock Island. We haven't reached the border yet. That's a different story, and I'll talk about that in a minute. At any rate, I think Rock Island really is not the town that Stevenson was. There was a town named Stevenson, but Rock Island is a new town, as Kai has suggested. Is our name here to stay? Well, in 1890 or thereabouts, an entrepreneur, real estate developer, took charge of a huge hunk of land from Augustana College over to the Moline border and down to the river and up to 14th Avenue, and plotted a huge town that was going to be the Queen City of the West. It is today called the Keystone Neighborhood. Some of you may be familiar with that because it was the Keystone. His idea was that eventually Rock Island and Moline would become suburbs of this grand new city. It didn't work out, and a few years later, in 1903, he went over and tried the same thing with East Moline, and it worked a little better. There is an East Moline today. Some of you may remember various attempts to bring the cities on the Rock Islands, on the Illinois side of the river together in one city. Why can't we have one city? Why can't we merge? The only one I really remember was in the 1980s when the Argus had a contest for what you would name a combination of Moline and Rock Island. And as I recall, the 3 winners were Twain, Mississippi's, or Roline. Would anybody here like to live in Moline? I don't think so. And it is not. It is not going to happen. So what? What difference does the name make? Well, you know, Shakespeare said a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I don't think so. Can you imagine a mighty railroad called the Chicago Stevenson? The Great Stevenson Line? No, it's the Rock Island Line. It's the Rock, right? I agree, Rock Island is a much better name than Stevenson. Thank you for your patience.
We are almost at the end of our appointed hour, but might be a time.
Sure,
One question, and I'll accept bribes. Please.
Yes.
What is the beginning of the name Rock Island? It is not an island.
Oh, it's this island right out here.
Because what we now call Arsenal Island, in the early maps was called Rocky Island.
Okay.
And that's how Rock Island City.
And Rock River.
And Rock River. But that was called the Rocky River too. So, well, it had a French name before it even became the Rocky River. But it's from the island, which now you don't refer to as Rock Island, but everybody, Davenport and the soldiers at Fort Armstrong would have called it Rocky Island.
Very good question, and thank you. Now we know that at least the bicentennial of Rock Island County will be in 17 years. That's when the clock, we've got the clock ticking to fix it in 17 years. We'll try to do it faster than that. Anyway, now come back next Tuesday when we hear a new professor to our series, Dr. Meg Kunde, talking about the history of inaugural addresses on the anniversary of the longest ever, which presaged one of the shortest presidencies. Then, come back November 1st, we'll all need a good laugh, and Dr. Kelly Daniels will be talking about punch and the history of satirical publications. And then finally, and I gotta get in touch with Lisa, we'll fix this or else we'll all get a flunking grade from Dr. Hammer. It's the dawn of Antarctic exploration, as our own Bill Hammer comes and talks about that wonderful history that had a turning point too in 1841. Thank you all for coming in such a beautiful day, but before we go, could we once again thank Dr. Roald Tweet.